The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Terminal B at Kennedy International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Flight attendant Rachel Wilson stood at her usual spot near the first-class check-in counter, adjusting her navy blue scarf with practiced precision. After 15 years with Pioneer Airways, she had mastered the art of appearing picture-perfect, from her immaculately pressed uniform to her professionally pinned back hair. "Another day, another flight," she whispered to herself, reviewing the passenger manifest for Flight 2317 to Chicago. At 43, Rachel considered herself one of the airline's finest senior flight attendants. Her supervisors often praised her attention to detail, though few knew about the carefully hidden prejudices that lurked beneath her polished exterior. As passengers began filtering through for early boarding, Rachel's attention was drawn to a man approaching the first-class lane. He wore an expensive charcoal gray suit and carried a leather briefcase, but something about him made her pause. The man pulled out his boarding pass with the confident ease of someone who flew frequently. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, extending his ticket. Rachel's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she studied the boarding pass. Dr. Adrian Parker, Seat 2A, First Class. Despite his clear premium status card and perfectly valid ticket, she felt an inexplicable need to verify his documentation. "Could you show me your ID as well?" she asked, her tone carrying an edge that hadn't been present with previous passengers. Dr. Parker produced his license without complaint, though a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He'd been through this before. As he waited, he absently adjusted his Rolex watch, a gift from his hospital board, for pioneering a revolutionary surgical technique. "Is there a problem?" he inquired politely when Rachel began scrutinizing his ID with unnecessary thoroughness. "Just following protocol," she replied curtly, despite having waved through several other first-class passengers moments before with barely a glance at their documentation. A young couple waiting in line exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman slowly reached for her phone, her instincts telling her something wasn't right about this interaction. Rachel continued her excessive verification process, pulling out a small ultraviolet light to check the boarding pass, a tool typically reserved for suspected fraudulent tickets. "We just need to be thorough with our security procedures," she added, emphasizing the last words. Dr. Parker maintained his professional demeanor, though his fingers tensed slightly around his briefcase handle. As chief of neurosurgery at Chicago Memorial, he'd faced subtle discrimination before, but it never stopped feeling like a quiet punch to the gut. "I have a surgery scheduled tomorrow morning," he mentioned calmly. "I fly this route twice a month for my patient consultations." Behind him, more passengers had begun to notice the unusual delay. An elderly gentleman shook his head disapprovingly, while a businesswoman in a sharp suit started filming discreetly with her phone. Rachel finally handed back his documents with obvious reluctance. "Everything appears to be in order," she said, her tone suggesting she believed quite the opposite. "Though I'll need to verify your status with my supervisor during the flight." Dr. Parker simply nodded, maintaining his dignity as he walked toward the jet bridge. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best response to prejudice was to rise above it, though he couldn't help but notice several phones pointed in his direction as he walked past the growing line of witnesses. Little did Rachel know that her actions in these few minutes would soon spiral into consequences she never imagined, setting off a chain of events that would shake her carefully constructed world to its core. The spacious cabin of Flight 2317 buzzed with pre-flight activity as passengers stored their bags and settled into their seats. Rachel walked through first class, her heels clicking against the carpet as she performed her usual pre-flight checks. She couldn't help but glance repeatedly at Dr. Parker in 2A, who was quietly reviewing medical files on his tablet. "Excuse me," Rachel's voice cut through the cabin noise as she approached him again. "I need to verify your ticket one more time." Several nearby passengers looked up, surprised by the unusual request. Dr. Parker had already been through security, gate check, and boarding pass verification. "Is this standard procedure?" he asked calmly, though wariness crept into his voice. "I don't recall being asked multiple times on my previous flights." He handed over his boarding pass again, maintaining his professional composure. A businessman across the aisle frowned, pausing his phone call. In row 3, a college professor graded papers while discreetly observing the interaction. The tension in the cabin grew palpable as Rachel made a show of checking the ticket yet again. "Well, we've had issues with passengers being in the wrong seats lately," Rachel said loudly enough for others to hear. Her implication hung heavy in the air. A young woman in row 4 shifted uncomfortably and pulled out her phone, adding to the growing number of passengers documenting the situation. "I assure you, I'm in the correct seat," Dr. Parker replied. He pulled out his phone, opening his airline app to show his recurring first-class bookings. "I fly this route regularly for my surgical consultations at Chicago Memorial." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Anyone can say that," she muttered, just loud enough to be heard. The passenger next to Dr. Parker, a retired teacher named Mrs. Chen, looked up sharply from her book. "Young lady," Mrs. Chen interjected, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years in education, "I couldn't help but notice this is the third time you've checked his ticket. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never seen such persistent verification." Other passengers began to murmur in agreement. A flight attendant named Tom, working in the economy section, paused while walking past, sensing the growing tension. He'd worked with Rachel before and had noticed certain patterns in her behavior, though she'd always been careful to maintain plausible deniability. "I'm simply doing my job," Rachel insisted, her voice taking on a defensive edge. She turned to Dr. Parker again. "Sir, if you could just show me your ID one more time." "Actually," interrupted a woman in a crisp business suit from row 2, "I've been recording this interaction. Would you like me to send it to Pioneer Airways customer service? I'm sure they'd be interested in reviewing your definition of doing your job." Rachel's face flushed. She hadn't noticed how many passengers had their phones out, quietly documenting her behavior. The businesswoman, who happened to be a corporate attorney, was already typing an email on her phone. Tom, the other flight attendant, stepped forward. "Rachel, can I speak with you in the galley?" His tone was professional but firm. As they walked away, passengers could hear him saying, "We need to discuss appropriate pre-flight procedures." Dr. Parker sat quietly, his expression composed but his shoulders tense. He'd faced similar situations throughout his career, in medical school, during his residency, and even after becoming a department chief. Each time, he chose to respond with dignity rather than anger, knowing his professionalism spoke louder than any emotional reaction. Mrs. Chen leaned over and spoke softly. "I'm sorry you had to experience that. Times are changing, but not fast enough." She smiled warmly, pulling out a business card. "I serve on the board of a civil rights organization. We might be interested in discussing this incident if you're willing." Meanwhile, in the galley, Rachel was beginning to realize the gravity of her actions. Through the cabin windows, she could see phones lighting up with social media notifications. Several passengers were typing furiously on their devices, and she caught phrases like "live tweeting this discrimination" and "can't believe this is happening in 2024. What had started as her usual subtle power play was quickly spiraling beyond her control. She didn't know it yet, but by the time this flight landed in Chicago, her actions would be trending on multiple social media platforms, forcing both her and the airline to face some uncomfortable truths about bias in the aviation industry. The tension in the first-class cabin continued to simmer as Flight 2317 prepared for takeoff. Rachel emerged from the galley, her face flushed from her conversation with Tom. She tried to avoid looking at Dr. Parker's seat, but she couldn't ignore the dozens of eyes following her every move. Walking past the first few rows, she loudly whispered to another flight attendant, "Keep an eye on 2A, something just doesn't feel right about him." Her voice, intentionally audible to nearby passengers, caused several heads to turn in disbelief. The business attorney in row 2 immediately pressed her phone's record button again. "For the record," she said clearly into her device, "the flight attendant is now suggesting other crew members should monitor a respected physician because, in her words, something doesn't feel right." Mrs. Chen closed her book with a sharp snap. "Young lady," she called out, her voice carrying the weight of decades of dealing with prejudice, "we can all hear you. And we all know exactly what you mean by something." Dr. Parker looked up from his medical files, his calm exterior masking his growing frustration. Years of experience had taught him how to handle such situations, but that didn't make them any less exhausting. He pressed the call button, its soft ding echoing through the tense cabin. Tom responded instead of Rachel, approaching with an apologetic smile. "How can I help you, sir?" "I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant," Dr. Parker requested politely. "I believe we need to address some concerns about professional conduct." The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. "Make that two of us," he added. "I've been flying this route weekly for 5 years, and I've never seen such blatant profiling." A young software developer from row 5 raised her hand. "3 of us. I've already uploaded 2 videos of this interaction to my social media. They're getting thousands of views by the minute." Tom nodded gravely. "I'll get Mr. Rodriguez right away." He turned and walked briskly toward the back of the plane, where the lead flight attendant was helping with final preparations. Rachel stood frozen in the galley, watching her carefully constructed professional world beginning to crumble. Through the cabin window, she could see passengers' phones lighting up with notifications. The hashtag Pioneer Airways was rapidly climbing trending lists, accompanied by clips of her earlier interactions with Dr. Parker. Mr. Rodriguez arrived quickly, his expression serious as he took in the scene. "Sir," he addressed Dr. Parker professionally, "would you mind stepping into the front galley with me for a moment?" As they moved to speak privately, Mrs. Chen turned to address the cabin. "I've been silent about discrimination too many times in my life," she announced. "Not today. Would anyone else like to provide a statement about what they've witnessed?" Hands rose throughout the first-class cabin. The business attorney pulled out her business card. "I'll be happy to collect witness statements and provide them to both the airline and relevant authorities." In the galley, Mr. Rodriguez listened intently to Dr. Parker's calm recounting of events. Halfway through the conversation, his eyes widened in recognition. "Dr. Parker, from Chicago Memorial?" he asked suddenly. "You're the surgeon who pioneered that new spinal surgery technique." Dr. Parker nodded modestly. "Yes, that's correct." "You saved my mother's life 6 months ago," Mr. Rodriguez said quietly. "She had a complicated tumor that other doctors said was inoperable. You gave her another chance at life." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone within Urshet. Here was a man who had saved countless lives, including the family member of an airline employee, being treated with suspicion and disrespect because of prejudice. Rachel, standing nearby, felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the magnitude of her actions. She watched as passengers continued documenting everything, their phones capturing every moment of her public unraveling. A gentle voice rose from the cabin, the college professor from row 3. "You know," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "this is a perfect example of why recording devices and social media have become so crucial in our society. Sometimes the only way to address systemic issues is to shine a light on them." The plane's engines hummed to life as the captain announced their imminent departure. But for Rachel, it felt like her world was shutting down. The videos were spreading, witnesses were organizing, and her years of hidden bias were about to be exposed to millions. As the aircraft prepared for takeoff, she couldn't help but wonder if this would be her last flight as a Pioneer Airways employee. As Flight 2317 reached cruising altitude, the story of Rachel's discriminatory behavior was already spreading like wildfire across social media. In the first-class cabin, Mr. Rodriguez had taken over the service duties personally, while Rachel was instructed to remain in the rear galley. "I just checked Twitter," the software developer announced quietly to those around her. "The first video has over 100,000 views already. People are furious." She showed her screen to Mrs. Chen, who nodded grimly at the mounting public reaction. The business attorney was busy organizing witness statements on her laptop. "I've received emails from 12 passengers so far," she told Dr. Parker. "Everyone wants to make sure this incident doesn't get swept under the rug." Mr. Rodriguez approached Dr. Parker with a fresh cup of coffee, his hands slightly trembling with emotion. "Doctor, I've been thinking about how to tell this story," he said softly. 6 months ago, my mother was given 2 months to live. Every surgeon said her tumor was too risky to operate on. But you," he paused, collecting himself, "you spent 6 hours in surgery and gave her a new life." The other passengers listened intently as Mr. Rodriguez continued. "She's now playing with her grandchildren again, tending to her garden. Last week, she even started volunteering at the local library." His voice cracked slightly. "And to think, the person who saved her life was treated this way on my flight. The college professor spoke up from her seat. This is exactly why these incidents need to be documented. It shows how prejudice can blind people to the humanity of others. She turned to the cabin. Think about it. A renowned surgeon who saves lives was profiled simply because of how he looks. At the back of the plane, Rachel sat alone, scrolling through her phone in horror. The videos had been picked up by major news outlets. Pioneer Airways' social media accounts were being flooded with angry comments. She watched as her actions were dissected by aviation experts, civil rights advocates, and thousands of ordinary citizens. A notification popped up on her screen. Pioneer Airways' HR department had already emailed her requesting an immediate meeting upon landing. Her hands shook as she read the message titled Urgent, Incident Review Required. Back in first class, a retired pilot seated in row 4 engaged in conversation with those around him. In my 30 years of flying, I've seen the aviation industry slowly change, he reflected. But moments like these show us how much work still needs to be done. The business attorney nodded in agreement. The airline's response to this will be crucial, she said. I've handled discrimination cases before, and this one is particularly egregious given the public nature of the incident and the number of witnesses. Dr. Parker remained composed, reviewing his surgical notes for tomorrow's procedure. A young passenger approached him hesitantly. Doctor, she said, my mom's a nurse at Chicago Memorial. She always talks about how you've revolutionized their neurosurgery department. I just wanted to say I'm sorry this happened to you. Mr. Rodriguez, overhearing this, made a decision. He picked up the cabin phone and called the captain. After a brief conversation, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I've been informed of the incident that occurred during boarding. I want to assure all passengers that Pioneer Airways has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. We will be filing a full report upon landing. The announcement was met with approving nods throughout the cabin. The software developer checked her phone again. The story's been picked up by national news networks, she announced. Pioneer Airways CEO has just released a statement saying they're launching an immediate investigation. Rachel, still isolated in the back, felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched her career crumbling in real time. A notification showed that her family members were calling, having seen the videos online. The weight of her actions was finally hitting her. Mr. Rodriguez made another round through first class, ensuring everyone was comfortable. He paused at Dr. Parker's seat. Doctor, my mother has a checkup appointment next month. I never thought I'd meet you like this, but I want you to know that what happened today won't be ignored. As the flight continued toward Chicago, the incident had become more than just a viral moment. It was turning into a catalyst for broader discussions about bias in the airline industry. Passengers throughout the cabin were sharing their own experiences, while others were already drafting letters to Pioneer Airways demanding systemic changes in staff training and accountability. The plane began its initial descent into Chicago, but for Rachel, it felt like her world had already landed with a crash. She knew that when those wheels touched down at O'Hare International Airport, she would be facing consequences that would reshape not just her career, but her entire perspective on life. As Flight 2317 touched down at O'Hare International Airport, 2 airline representatives in dark suits were already waiting at the gate. The videos of Rachel's discriminatory behavior had reached Pioneer Airways corporate headquarters, triggering an immediate crisis response. Our corporate office has requested an urgent debrief, one of the representatives explained to Mr. Rodriguez as passengers began gathering their belongings. Rachel sat silently in the back galley, her usual confidence completely shattered. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from friends and family who had seen the viral videos. The business attorney stood up, straightening her blazer. I've collected statements from 23 passengers, she announced to the representatives. I've also downloaded all the video evidence and documented the timeline of events. Would you like my card? In the terminal, a small crowd had gathered. News of the incident had spread rapidly across Chicago, especially after people recognized Dr. Parker's name. A local reporter stood nearby, preparing for a live broadcast about the incident. Pioneer Airways is facing intense backlash today, the reporter spoke into her microphone, after videos surfaced showing one of their senior flight attendants repeatedly harassing a prominent Chicago neurosurgeon. The incident has sparked outrage across social media platforms. Rachel was escorted to a private office in the airport, where 3 members of the airline's HR department were waiting. The room felt suffocating as she watched them review the videos on their tablets. Each clip showed her behavior from different angles, leaving no room for denial or explanation. Over 500,000 views in just 3 hours, one HR manager said, looking up from his screen. The hashtag Pioneer Airways discrimination is trending nationally. Can you explain your actions? Back in the terminal, Dr. Parker was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. A nurse from Chicago Memorial had seen the videos and came to the airport to show support. "Doctor, the entire hospital staff is outraged," she said. "We've all seen how tirelessly you work to save lives, regardless of who your patients are." The retired pilot from the flight approached the airline representatives. "I flew for Pioneer for 30 years, he said firmly. "This incident isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about the culture we create in aviation. We need systematic changes in training and accountability." Mrs. Chen had already begun drafting an email to her civil rights organization. "This is a textbook case," she explained to the business attorney. "It demonstrates exactly how discrimination often occurs in public spaces, subtle at first, but escalating when unchallenged." The software developer refreshed her social media feed. "Pioneer Airways stock price is dropping," she noted. "Their investors are demanding answers. Corporate headquarters just announced an emergency board meeting." Inside the private office, Rachel watched as the HR team played another clip, this time of her telling other crew members to keep an eye on Dr. Parker. Her words, dripping with prejudice, sounded even worse played back. A tear rolled down her cheek as she realized the full impact of her actions. I didn't think," she started, but the HR director held up his hand. "That's precisely the problem," he said firmly. "You didn't think about the human being in seat 2A. You didn't think about his dignity, his rights, or his humanity. Instead, you acted on prejudices that have no place in our airline or in our society." Meanwhile, Pioneer Airways' PR team had gone into overdrive. Their social media accounts posted a statement. "We are deeply disturbed by the incident on Flight 2317. The employee in question has been suspended pending investigation. Pioneer Airways stands firmly against discrimination in all forms." Local news crews interviewed passengers as they left the terminal. The college professor spoke eloquently about the broader implications. Today showed how quickly justice can work in the age of social media. But it also showed how much discrimination still exists in everyday situations. Mr. Rodriguez gave his statement to the airline representatives, his voice thick with emotion as he described how Dr. Parker had saved his mother's life. "How do you thank someone who gave your family more years together, only to watch them be humiliated on your own flight?" he asked. The business attorney organized her files as she prepared to leave. "The evidence is overwhelming," she told the airline representatives. "Pioneer Airways needs to do more than just handle this one incident. They need to review their entire training program and corporate culture." Rachel sat alone in the office, waiting for the final decision from HR. Through the window, she could see more news vans arriving at the airport. Her phone showed missed calls from her supervisor, her family, and even her old flight school instructors who had seen the videos. As the sun began to set over O'Hare, the incident had become more than just a viral moment. It was turning into a wake-up call for the entire airline industry. Rachel's actions, captured and shared by dozens of witnesses, would force not just Pioneer Airways, but airlines across the country to confront the reality of discrimination in their ranks. The next morning, Rachel sat in her small apartment, staring at her TV in disbelief. Every major news channel was covering the incident. Her hands trembled as she watched clips of herself, her actions dissected by news anchors and civil rights experts. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. "Pioneer Airways has released surveillance footage from the gate showing multiple instances of discriminatory behavior. The airline's board of directors has called an emergency meeting to address what they're calling a significant failure in corporate culture." Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Have you seen the newspaper? You're on the front page." Rachel pulled up the digital edition and felt her stomach drop. The headline read, "Airline Under Fire. Discrimination incident exposes industry-wide problems. In her kitchen, a stack of letters caught her eye. Commendations from previous years, certificates of excellence in customer service. They seemed to mock her now. How had she convinced herself that her subtle prejudices weren't harmful? The reality of her actions was staring her in the face on every screen. Meanwhile, at Chicago Memorial Hospital, Dr. Parker was preparing for surgery. News crews waited outside, hoping to get a statement. Inside, the hospital staff had rallied around him. The chief of staff made an announcement over the hospital's intercom system. Today, we stand with our colleague who, despite facing discrimination, will still perform 3 life-saving surgeries. This is the true measure of professionalism and character. Back in her apartment, Rachel opened her email to find hundreds of messages. Some expressed anger, others disappointment. But one caught her eye. It was from a diversity training expert. Your incident has gone viral, but it's not too late to learn from this. The question is, are you ready to confront your own biases and grow from this experience? The Pioneer Airways HR department had scheduled a final meeting for that afternoon. As Rachel got dressed, putting on civilian clothes instead of her uniform for the first time in years, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The person staring back seemed different somehow, humbled, scared, and finally beginning to understand the weight of her actions. At the airline's headquarters, the meeting room was crowded with executives and legal representatives. The head of HR placed a thick folder on the table, printed copies of social media responses, news articles, and witness statements. The company's reputation was taking a massive hit. Our stock has dropped 12%, one executive reported. We're facing boycott threats. Major corporate clients are reconsidering their contracts. This isn't just about one incident anymore, it's about systematic change. Rachel listened as they detailed the impact of her actions. The business attorney from the flight had submitted a comprehensive report, complete with time-stamped videos and passenger testimonials. The evidence was overwhelming. We've received over 50,000 comments on our social media platforms, the PR director added. People are sharing their own experiences with discrimination in air travel. This has opened a floodgate. The head of HR turned to Rachel. Your employment with Pioneer Airways is terminated, effective immediately. But this is bigger than just losing your job. Your actions have forced us to confront serious issues within our airline. As she handed over her airline ID and security badges, Rachel felt tears welling up. 15 years of her life ended because of prejudices she'd never properly confronted. The HR director wasn't finished. We're implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. Our hiring practices are being reviewed. Policy changes are being drafted. Your actions caused this crisis, but perhaps some good can come from it. Outside the building, more news crews waited. Rachel slipped out a side door, but not before hearing a reporter's voice. Pioneer Airways announces comprehensive overhaul of diversity training following viral discrimination incident. That evening, alone in her apartment, Rachel watched one final news segment. Dr. Parker was being interviewed after completing his surgeries. His words hit her hard. I've spent my life saving people regardless of who they are. Today, I performed surgery on 3 patients. One of them was the grandfather of a Pioneer Airways employee. When he wakes up, he won't care about the color of my skin. He'll care that he gets to see his grandchildren grow up. Rachel turned off the TV and sat in silence. Her phone showed more missed calls, more messages, more reactions to her viral moment of prejudice. But for the first time, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about all the people she'd made feel unwelcome over the years. She opened her laptop and began typing, "Dear Dr. Parker." The letter wouldn't change what happened, but perhaps it could be the first step in her own journey of change. The world had seen her worst moment. Now she had to decide who she would become after it. 3 months had passed since the incident on Flight 2317. Pioneer Airways headquarters buzzed with activity as employees gathered in the main conference room for their first mandatory anti-bias training session. The room fell silent as the guest speaker approached the podium. It was Dr. Parker. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and measured. "Many of you know me from a viral video. But today, I'm here not to dwell on that incident, but to help create positive change." The audience sat up straighter, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. In the back of the room, Mr. Rodriguez, now promoted to chief flight attendant trainer, watched with pride. His mother sat beside him, fully recovered from her surgery, there to share their story as part of the training. Change doesn't come from punishment alone, Dr. Parker continued. It comes from understanding, from recognition, and from the courage to confront our own biases. He clicked to a slide showing statistics about discrimination in the travel industry. Meanwhile, across town, Rachel sat in a small coffee shop, reading an article about Pioneer Airways' transformation. The airline had completely overhauled its training programs, revised its hiring practices, and created a new diversity and inclusion department. Her own life had changed dramatically. After her termination, she'd spent weeks in deep reflection. The viral incident had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. Now, she worked with a civil rights organization, sharing her story as a cautionary tale and example of personal growth. Back at the training session, the business attorney who had documented the incident was presenting the legal aspects of discrimination. "This isn't just about following rules," she explained. "It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who steps onto your aircraft." The software developer from the flight had been hired by Pioneer Airways to create a new reporting system for bias incidents. "We've developed an app," she demonstrated to the room, "that allows passengers to report concerns in real time, ensuring transparency and accountability." Mrs. Chen, watching from her seat on the airline's newly formed passenger advisory board, nodded in approval. The changes weren't just superficial, they were systematic and meaningful. During a break, Mr. Rodriguez shared his family's story. "Dr. Parker saved my mother's life," he said, his voice emotional. "But more than that, this incident saved our airline's soul. We're building a culture where every passenger is treated with dignity." The training session included role-playing scenarios, group discussions, and real-world examples. Employees shared their own experiences, both as witnesses to discrimination and sometimes as people who had held unconscious biases. A young flight attendant raised her hand. "I used to think I treated everyone equally," she admitted. "But this training has shown me biases I didn't even know I had. How do we keep improving?" Dr. Parker smiled. "That's exactly the right question. Change isn't a destination, it's a journey. Every interaction is a chance to be better than we were yesterday." Outside the conference room, Pioneer Airways' new CEO gave a press interview. "Our incident 3 months ago was a wake-up call," she acknowledged. "But look at what we've built from it. New policies, better training, real accountability. We're setting a new standard for the industry." The airline's efforts were showing results. Customer satisfaction scores had improved. Other airlines were adopting similar training programs. The incident had sparked a nationwide conversation about discrimination in air travel. As the training session concluded, Dr. Parker shared one final thought. 3 months ago, I was just another passenger facing discrimination. Today, I'm part of the solution. That's what real change looks like." Rachel watched the evening news coverage of the training session from her apartment. Her letter of apology to Dr. Parker, written months ago, had led to an unexpected dialogue. Though she could never undo her actions, she had found a way to turn her mistake into a tool for teaching others. The next morning, as Pioneer Airways Flight 2317 prepared for takeoff, the same route where everything had started, things were visibly different. The crew was diverse, the passengers were treated with equal respect, and a framed commitment to inclusion hung in the terminal. Every passenger who boards our aircraft brings their own story. Our job is not to judge those stories, but to ensure that every chapter written on our flights is one of dignity, respect, and belonging. As the plane lifted into the sky, it carried more than just passengers. It carried the promise of change, proof that even the darkest moments could lead to brighter tomorrows if we have the courage to learn from them.